Chers auditeurs, chers collègues, nous allons reprendre. Alors évidemment, comme nous l'avions annoncé, cette conférence qui se tenait en français hier se poursuit en anglais aujourd'hui. Il y a un petit effet sélectif sur l'audience. Nous nous y attendions. Nous allons donc écouter ce matin l'exposé introductif, l'exposé inaugural, Keynote speech, comme on dit en anglais, de Madame Brenda Yeoh, qui est une géographe de l'immigration mondialement connue, qui vient de l'Université nationale donc, de Singapour. Marie-Caroline Saglio-Yatzimirsky, donc nouvelle directrice de l'Institut Conférence Migration, dont je ne suis plus que le président maintenant, va introduire, donc, vous présenter Brenda Yeoh. L'exposé va durer 45 minutes, quelque chose comme ça. Et ensuite, nous continuerons le colloque, mais il y aura sans doute une discussion. Voilà, ce n'était que quelques mots d'introduction. Je laisse la parole aux véritables acteurs.
So thank you for joining us for this second day of International Conference. As you know, it's a day of mobilization also in France about pension, and I hope you won't be too caught up in the dilemma of whether to stay and listen to us in this sumptuous Collège de France or whether to demonstrate in the pavement of Paris. And it's a sunny day today. Yesterday, all day long, we were able to discuss key issues on concerning dynamics of work and migration. And the Kesang-Tseten film is, I think, a perfect link with today's discussion. The film follows low-wage Nepali workers in the Gulf. It shows us a new model of migration based on constraint and inequality and defining a spatial politics of non-integration. I think Brenda will come back to this paradigm. So today, our keynote speaker, Brenda Yeoh, will bring this new paradigm in migration studies, which will be based on our East Asian network. So let me introduce Brenda. Brenda Yeoh is Raffles Professor of Social Science, National University of Singapore, and research leader, Asian Migration Cluster at the National University of Singapore Asia Research Institute. She was awarded the Vautrin Lud Prize for Outstanding Achievements in Geography in 2021. Her research interests in Asian migration span themes such as gender, social reproduction and care migration, skilled migration, cosmopolitanism, higher education, international student mobilities, and marriage, migrants, and cultural politics. So here stops the short biography sent by Brenda, but it's only a small snapshot that doesn't reflect the depth and the strength of her astonishing work. The books she published are milestones in contemporary migration research, enabling her to pinpoint new dynamics and to compare between East Asia, North America, and Europe. So I will just quote a few of them, like migrant workers in Singapore, lives and labor in a transient migration regime in 2022, handbook on transnationalism, 2022, student mobilities and international education in Asia, 2020, transnational migration in the Asia Pacific in 2018, etc. So after Brenda's talk, throughout the day, the researchers from our institute and their guests will discuss crucial issues. There will be a first roundtable discussion by the Department Dynamics on immigration, economy, and labor markets. And then it will be followed by a second session organized by the Department Policy. And finally, there will be a meeting session with researchers, trade unionists, and the Director of Labor Relations of Services. So this last session will bring us back to the ultra-contemporary issue of foreign workers accommodating rights. Okay, Brenda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here, in this beautiful space. Of course, in this beautiful city, one is never far from any kind of astounding sights in Paris, and I feel especially welcomed by Professor Héran to this setting. My apologies that I don't speak or understand French, so the limitations of cross-cultural communications. But I'll try my best to in a sense, present my thoughts on this, to me, a very important topic. And I do welcome questions after which, hopefully the questions, whether in English or in French, could help to help us communicate and in a sense, build a mutual sort of relations of understanding. So the topic for today is the temporary migration regime and non-integration dynamics. And I'm going to focus on Singapore's migrant workers at the height of the pandemic, as well as in post-pandemic times, as a sort of case study to illustrate some of the more conceptual ideas. So it has 7 sections, and I'll try to be brief in each section. So I've also put quite a lot of words on the slides in case you're not following my English, so you could read off the slides as well. So first, to lay the context and to provide the conceptualizations, I wanted first turn to transnational migration in Asia. And as I think most people know, Asia is indeed a very varied, kaleidoscopic region with a long shared history of colonialism as well as post-colonial nation building. It is a region that's immensely driven by socio-economic inequalities as well as deep-seated cultural differences, and of course, wide divergence in political regimes. So in a sense, there's no one Asia. It's very difficult to speak about Asia as a whole. There are just so many differences and diversities cross-cutting the region. But migration, in some ways, is a constant that is inextricably linked to the social transformations of the region. It's linked to both economic development as well as demographic change in Asia. And in recent decades, we've seen the rise of transnational migration, not just in volume, but also in velocity, in complexity, and as a vital transformation force. So you see that, so just to give you very, very basic statistics, that Asia is a large continent with 2/3 of the world's population, the origin of 40% of the world's international migrants. That is, of course, a generalization, but I think it's good to keep in mind the fact that this international migration is both within the region as well as beyond the region. So intra-regional migration within the region, that actually accounts for more than half of the Asian migrants on the move, 66 million in 2019 before the pandemic. And migrants moving out of Asia, the extra-regional migrants, number around 44.6 million. So we are talking about a very large number of peoples of great diversities. So in terms of when and why did this happen? So just to give a little bit of background, with the oil boom in the 1970s, large-scale labor migration started then, and this is a time when many Asian countries were still in the process of nation building. They were all, in a sense, new nation states after the war and after gaining independence in the 1960s, largely. So nation building projects in Asia are quite different from European models. Not only is it new, but it differs from European models that are based on homogeneity and common heritage. It's also different from North American and Australasian settler colonies that features versions of multiculturalism that privilege white subjects as the core of the nation. In Southeast Asia, and again, I'm trying to break up Asia into its different parts, and it's kind of quite a difficult enterprise given the variety, but in Southeast Asia, the post-colonial nation states in Southeast Asia tend to build nationhood, nation states from an already existing plurality that's, in a sense, rooted in the diasporas of colonial times. So these, from the very start, these nation states already contained diasporic elements from multiple places within its national territory. For East Asian polities, a sense of nationhood is based on idealized narratives of ethnic homogeneity, and here I'm referring to like Japan and Korea. To summarize everything, Asian labor migration systems that were, in a sense, had their roots at that period, the 1970s, had to try to minimize the challenges to the fragile imaginary of the nation state, which is relatively new, and they did so by keeping migration temporary. So this leads me to the temporary migration regime in Asia, and this is, in a sense, based on keeping migration temporary. So in many Asian countries, apart from a very small privileged pathway for highly skilled migrants to gain residency and citizenship, the large majority of lower-waged workers do not have this pathway to residency or citizenship. As Aziz and Batistella says, most Asian receiving nation states ruled out settlement, family reunification, and long-term integration, including citizenship for the less skilled migrants. And this is pursued not only by receiving nation states in Asia, but is something that sending states are also complicit. So sending states like the Philippines and Indonesia that sends out, large numbers of migrant workers, they also encourage temporariness and the eventual return of their citizens and their sojourners abroad. Why? Because not just for to minimize brain drain, but very importantly to secure remittance flows, homeward investments, and to develop transnational linkages for economic development. So in summary, whilst we can say that migration pathways to permanent residency worldwide today are narrowing, there are far fewer sort of pathways to permanency these days. What distinguishes Asian migration is the fact that temporary migration is the mainstay of transnational labor circulation in Asia from the very start, in the early days of nation building. So it is with this context that we then turn to understand the temporariness in Asian migrations. And the two concepts that are often used is that of enforced transience and permanent temporariness. So this, in a sense, I'm not going to speak too much about this, but in a sense, we need a shift in migration theory to move away from more Western-centric paradigms that are based on the usual assumptions that of assimilation, of acculturation, and integration as the goals of whole society. So this is, in a sense, more difficult to, it's not appropriate to cling on to these paradigms too much when we are trying to understand the place of the migrant in whole society in Asia. So my sort of work has been to try to see what sorts of conceptual apparatus we need to understand the place of the migrant in host society in Asia, and notions of enforced transience and permanent temporariness opens up the research for me to look at the precarious conditions under which low-wage migrant workers are, as they say, permitted to labor, but not to stay. So some of the conditions, of course, involves constraining the length of stay and employment mobility, and this is by law, but also social factors like stigmatization, discrimination, and xenophobia. Very important is a diminished access to social protection that migrant workers have access to, and this leads to the long-standing transnational family. which in a sense is a separation, a long-term separation of production and reproduction that in a sense sustains the family. So one of my projects has to do with migrant domestic workers that I'll speak to in a while, but many migrant domestic workers have been working in Singapore as solo migrants for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, in order to send remittances back to their so-called left-behind families. This is an example of the separation of production and reproduction that is ingrained and inscribed in the temporariness of transnational migration in Asia. So turning then to the topic for today, my main point here is to, in a sense, look afresh at the politics of space in migrant-host encounters within Asian migration scholarship. So the main argument here is that migrant spatial concentrations operate differently under temporary migration regimes, and the whole point of this talk is to try to understand how these operate and with what effects. The spatial formations that basically are based on the ephemeral hold of transient migrants on the city's public spaces. And to cut to the chase, I want to focus on two concepts, the twin processes of enclavization and enclosure, and the ensuing spatial politics. So let me briefly explain. I think what I wanted to show with these photographs is this is an example of a migrant enclave. This is Little India in Singapore, and which in a sense helps us understand the processes of enclavization. And this is the same migrant workers in a migrant dormitory, and I'm going to be using that to explain the idea of enclosure. So with enclavization, I use it to refer to the spatial temporal processes where transient migrant populations stake temporary claims on the city's public spaces to facilitate migrant sociality and networking. As you see here, a group of migrant domestic workers gathering on the grounds of the public spaces of a particular cathedral at the heart of the city. So these spatial forms of social enclosure are, of course, in part based on migrants' strategic choice. They choose to gather, you might say. But of course, they do so under constraints by host society's exclusionary politics. So in that sense, choice and constraint are flip sides of the same coin. So in many parts of Asia, these are called weekend enclaves because they're not residential enclaves. They are weekend enclaves, and more pejoratively sometimes referred to as migrant hotspots or gathering grounds. These enclave spaces are ephemeral in nature. They are formed and unformed through a variety of practices, tensions, dynamics, and politics. They essentially emerge during the weekend when the migrant workers have the day off or some time off, and they disappear throughout the work week when the migrant workers are busy at work. So the difference here is that in Western cities, we often speak of enclaves as though they're residential. In this case, they are ephemeral spaces of socializing and networking that are transient in nature. Enclosure, I use this term to refer to the construction of borders, and these borders could be symbolic borders, could be material borders that mark separation and containment of the migrant other. And examples include dormitory complexes that I'm going to speak of, but also gated communities and confinement camps. They offer a psychological buffer between the so-called insiders and outsiders, and enclosure always serves to reinforce understandings of difference. They also allow migrants to be governed from at a distance through intervening in their everyday lives and their affective relations in producing conditions of precarity and subjection. So now I move on to the next part of the talk that introduces very briefly Singapore. a globalizing city-state of 5.7 million people, where more than 1 million are low-wage transient workers living and working in the city. So just a little bit more in-depth here, won't go into details, but of the 5.7 million, the foreign workers on contracts, on time-limited contracts called work permits, account for about 17% of the total population of 5.7 million. As you can see, Singapore citizens, the red part, only accounts for about 3.5 million people on the island of Singapore. The rest, the other full 1/3, are people who are either migrants or, well, they're all migrants, I mean, whether with residency or not. So the two groups I'm going to be focusing on are migrant construction workers, of which there are about 300,000 in Singapore, and migrant domestic workers, of which there are about 250,000 in Singapore. So how does enforced transience work in Singapore? Well, there are no pathways to permanent residency and citizenship for these low-wage migrant workers. They are also under constant surveillance through regular medical examinations. Additionally, for female workers, they are subjected to pregnancy tests every 6 months, so which then limits family formation. So these work permit holders are not permitted to marry Singaporeans or PRs, nor allowed to bring family members with them. As you can see, these are conditions that, in a sense, enforce transience not just of the individual migrant, but of the migrant family. So family formation is suppressed. So in sum, these workers are governed on the principles of non-integration. So the idea is that they should not integrate, they should remain separate, and should remain disposable, rather than ideas about promoting acculturation and sense of belonging. So in the study that we did, we looked at, that we've been following, in a sense, over the years, two groups of transient labor in Singapore, highly gendered. We looked at Indonesian domestic workers, and they're all female. And we also looked at Bangladeshi construction workers, and they're all male. I won't explain the methods, but it's largely qualitative studies, but with ongoing ethnographic observations that we try to, in a sense, make use of NGO surveys wherever possible. So the focus here is on two sets of conjoined processes that underpin the spatial politics of non-integration. One is ground-driven enclavization in the formation of these weekend enclaves and gathering grounds, which we could refer to as co-national social spaces of support or comfort zones of co-ethnic belonging. Highly racialized, but that's the nature of the spatial politics in Singapore. And on the other hand, we want to look also at state-driven enclosure, which in the case of the female domestic workers, confine them to home space, and in the case of the male construction workers, care and control can be found in the purpose-built dormitories that are found in the peripheral locations in Singapore. So I will now first turn to dormitory spaces to look at the politics of enclosure. So here we see in this sort of map the migrant worker dormitories that are set apart from citizen homes, located at the peripheral sites around the island, either in peripheral sites or in industrial areas. So based on the idea that spatial distance would be a natural barrier to minimize psychological discomforts and minimize face-to-face interactions. And when the state fails to set apart the migrant dormitories, this tends to kindle not in my backyard kind of sentiments as seen in an old case by now, in Serangoon Gardens, a middle-class estate, where the government was trying to build a dormitory next to this middle-class housing estate, and the residents of Serangoon Gardens then petitioned saying that the workers would commit crimes, the usual, right? Seduce their mates and dampen property prices. So what the state then did is to use the strategy of enclosure in building these dormitories, of which some are mega dormitories. This is one example, the Tuas View dormitory at the periphery of the island. It is, when it was built and first opened in 2014, said to be the first integrated facility of its kind. It has 16,800 beds and have full facilities like a mini-mart, a beer garden, a food court, recreational options like a cinema and a cricket field that will appeal to the South Asians within its compound. And what was amazing to me is the way that Tuas View Dormitory was advertised. If you look at this banner that advertises the dormitory, it says, mega, modern, integrated. And what takes the cake is that it has sea view, because it's so peripheral. So, yeah, so this is, in a sense, an example, the enclosure. Within dormitory space, many things are provided. So, in a sense, it's, you can say, a caring space in terms of providing money transfer facilities, washing, cooking, barber facilities, training facilities. The occupants are housed in large rooms in what's double-decker beds, and note that because I'll come back to that. Usually before the pandemic, about 30 to 40 a room. So, you see here another set of photographs to do with the dormitories featuring sky gardens with greenery, sort of recreational corners. And in this case, the dormitory is said to be air-conditioned. So, but of course, care is only the flip side of control, because if you look at the house rules that are in small print around the dormitory, this one says, in-house rules and regulations, things like no alcohol, no smoking, no cooking, no feeding of stray animals, as well as like no fighting, no pornography, no use of abusive language that's offensive to religion or racial comments, which is a big issue for Singapore, a multiracial society, and of course, lights out by 11 p.m. So in that sense, care and control are again flip sides of the same coin. And why this strategy of enclosure? Enclosure basically does many things. One is it facilitates the packing in of bodies according to the economic logic of demand and cost-saving measures. Here I present some quotes from the migrant workers that we interviewed. Said says that when he first came, he was put in a container. There were 6 of them in the top, and 5 below, and it's usually based on demand. If there are more people, then there will be a crowd. So it's your luck of the draw whether there's high demand or not. They were housed, when they moved to Tuas View, a big room, 35 to 40 in a single room, 7 toilets, 7 washrooms, 1 person in every bed. What struck us in Sumon's quote is the mutual surveillance that is effected. So Sumon says that he sleeps on the floor. Why? We ask him, why do you want to sleep on the floor when you do have a bed space? Says that the top bed in the double-decker moves and it breaks his sleep, disrupts his sleep, and if he can't sleep, he feels bad the next day. So the floor doesn't move, though it's hard, but now I'm used to it. Therefore, I prefer to sleep on the floor. This gives you a sense of the packing in of bodies and the mutual surveillance that's possible, where every tiny movement is under someone's gaze. So, of course, there's also technological surveillance deployed through CCTV cameras and a biometric security system. But what the workers tend to fear most is fellow occupants as human surveillance, because the worst thing for a migrant worker is to be repatriated before the contract comes in end, and that is the constant pressure. They are, in a sense, most of them have already incurred large debts in coming to Singapore to finance their journey to Singapore and also to gain a job. So they will do anything but be repatriated. So Hussein says that My boss won't arbitrarily send people home, but if people fight, as in the case of these 3 Chinese men, and someone reported them to the manager, they were then repatriated, and that was his greatest fear. In terms of social life in a dormitory, well, it ranges from those who really enjoy multicultural, multinational social life in the dormitory to those who feel it's extreme isolation. So Sajib, on one hand, says that socializing within the dormitory is quite sufficient. There's no need to go outside. The dormitory very big. Inside there's cricket, there's football, all kinds of nationalities, Bangladesh, Indian, Chinese, Thailand, Myanmar. I can talk to people of different nationalities, cook with them, play games. I have many friends. So, whereas Mainol, on the other hand, said that he felt very isolated, largely because he lived on a dormitory which is on an island, a gated petrochemical complex. So he says that there's a problem, he cannot come out except on weekends, and he's nothing to do in the dormitory. He says that there's entertainment, there's playground, there's a canteen, there's TV, but no satellite channels, so nothing in his language or in his within his sense of humor, for example. So he actually pointed out that they actually don't have much time to relax because the working hours can stretch from 7:30 to 7:30 p.m., 8:30 p.m., sometimes 10:30 p.m., and they almost always have to work Saturdays and Sundays. So these are the 2 sort of extreme cases of either end of the spectrum. I will now turn to the politics of enclosure within the home spaces of the female Indonesian domestic workers. So in Singapore, 80% of the citizenry live in public housing estates, and these are in flats, high-rise flats that could be small, could also be medium, could be quite large. But whatever the size of the flat, there's no separate space to cater to the live-in domestic worker, and all domestic workers have to be live-in. So for 20% of the cases, those who live in private housing, in condominiums and landed homes, there's usually a maid's room. But again, this could vary from a small windowless space, Harry Potter style kind of cubicle, to an ensuite sort of room. So it's, again, luck of the draw. So these female domestic workers inhabit enclosure space where the boundaries between home and work are extremely blurred. So their living quarters are within the employers' homes, which are also their workspaces. So in spatial terms, many of them learn very quickly to avoid or to become invisible in the front stage where the activities of the employers dominate, and to retreat to the backstage, such as the kitchen, in order to try to reclaim whatever privacy possible. And we see this, in a sense, happening in all the work that's done on domestic workers, Hong Kong, Taipei, and so forth. Nicole Constable, more than 20 years ago, already said that the confluence of home and workplace makes it very difficult for household workers, not only to separate work spatially, but also temporally. It's very difficult to distinguish time on and time off. So in the case of Una, and this is not a picture of Una, this is just an internet picture, but Una says that this kind of blurred distinction between home and work leads to continuous surveillance for her. She says that the employer, is not working, so she's at home all the time. She always comes around me, watching over whatever I'm doing. I don't have enough time to sleep. I also have to sleep next to the kitchen on a very tiny folding bed. And she points out that actually the employer has a big house, empty rooms, 2 empty rooms, in fact. But as she says, you domestic worker, you can't have that kind of life, right? In Singapore, we have no rights at all. So this is, in a sense, enforced transience in order to deepen migrant precarity as a way of keeping them transient. So in terms of control and mobility, both inside and outside the home, Nanning says that sometimes employers don't allow them to go out of the home, and it feels like jail. She talks about her past employer, not the present one, that didn't allow them to go out at all and will actually lock the house. And the employer sister would come every day. She owns the keys, not me. I stayed at home every time. So for those who live in employers' homes that are in condominiums, for example, the mobility is not just enforced, but sometimes circumscribed by both written and unwritten rules. Like, for example, are they supposed to be using the condominium facilities, like the swimming pool? So there are signs up in some condominiums that, in a sense, as it says here, house rules designed to ensure mates know their place. They are not supposed to be using the gym or the swimming pool and so forth. So in that sense, again, these are rules that enforces precarity and transience. Technological surveillance in the form of CCTV cameras are also deployed in some cases. I think the NGOs found about 20% of the cases there are CCTV cameras watching the domestic worker. And we didn't find any in those that we interviewed, but from the NGO report, there is instances of, for example, this Filipino domestic worker who says that she can't sleep because of the camera's blinking light, and that led to extreme distress, and she ultimately was sent home. So to summarize, for the male construction workers, enclosure facilitates care and secures compliance by segregating and distancing migrant spaces, keeping them out of sight and under surveillance, especially when they are not at labor. So fine, when they're at labor, they're productive migrant workers, but once they're not at labor, then surveillance kicks in. For the female domestic workers, spatial proximity within the home is not avoidable. So control is largely effected through spatial and temporal confinement to domestic spaces and the close scrutiny of individual behavior to ensure self-compliance with unwritten expectations of being in place and out of place. Finally, I turn to enclavization and its limits. So, as mentioned before, these weekend enclaves where migrant workers meet up during the weekends in order to network with their friends and fellow workers. So in Singapore, core national enclaves over the weekend includes Little Manila, where the Philippine domestic workers tend to gather. As you see here, Lucky Plaza is one of the shopping centers along Orchard Road. That's the center of Little Manila. And Little India, you saw pictures of that before, where the South Asian, mainly male construction workers gather. So these weekend enclaves mark a very distinctively different rhythm for the migrants because they have time away from the structured timetables, the constrained mobility, and the unremitting surveillance of the work week. So these weekend enclaves tend to be seen as intrusive spaces by citizens, and occasionally you will see letters to the authorities asking them to step up security measures or relocate these workers out of sight as though there's anywhere else to go on our small island. And residents in public housing estates within these enclaves, like Little India, put up steel barricades, symbolic rather than physical barricades, around their blocks to keep foreign workers out. This particular poster is interesting because, of course, it's not unusual to see posters that says fine for littering in Singapore, but this one is kind of quite unusual because it's not just no littering, it's also no urinating, no sleeping, and no eating in the languages of the migrant workers. And of course, when I was wandering around in Little India, the workers were just sleeping and resting right under one of these posters. So just would mention the Little India riots in passing. Don't have time to dwell into it, but this is a watershed because we don't usually have riots in Singapore since the 1950s and 60s, but the Little India riots in 2013 was a case when Indian national who was killed under a bus. The bus was supposed to ferry the worker from the enclave back to their dormitories. So this resulted in sort of angry mobs attacking the bus and emergency vehicle, and Little India came to a standstill for 2 hours. So this is a kind of big event with many consequences, which I won't have time to elaborate on, but it certainly led to increased surveillance and the banning of alcohol in Little India. But what I want to turn to is the more regular kind of effects of surveillance beyond the riots, where migrant workers who already have very little time off work they are themselves very conscious of the limits that permeate their claims to public spaces. So Sumon here says, yes, on Sundays, I sometimes go and chit-chat in the enclave, right? But I only go there once a month, no more, because he doesn't feel that easy. Hera, who's a domestic worker, says that she also goes to the gathering grounds for Indonesian domestic workers and to talk, to chit-chat, to eat. But she always tries to remain near an MRT station in order to be home quickly. So she says that the curfew set by an employer is 7 p.m., but she says that she's always home by 6:30, implying that she has never violated the curfew. So in that sense, these kinds of surveillance are internalized by the migrants themselves, as also seen here, where they are very aware of the negative sentiments towards the enclave, and they try to project themselves as self-disciplined migrants rather than the unruly object of discrimination. So Mishket says, people are not the same. Some people, they come to the enclave only to gossip, walk around. I don't have that intention. I never face discrimination from the locals. We Bangladeshis are different from others. You realize how divided the language is, but that is, in a sense, a product of the racialized dynamics in Singapore as well. She says that we Bangladeshis maintain neat and clean, good dress, walk with good people. We act gently, we work decently, we are clean shaven, we dress up smart. So when I go out, Singaporeans don't feel that I'm a worker here. Unlike, and he tries to distance himself from the other nationalities, then he sort of laughs a little bit about it and says, well, this is personal, so, and he trails off. So in that sense, migrant workers find that they have to justify access to the relative freedoms of the enclave. They do so by presenting themselves as trustworthy, accountable subjects who are ever conscious of their position in Singapore society. So Novi, who has been in Singapore for more than 20 years, says that every time she wants to visit an enclave, she will explain to her employer, even though they trust me, every time I go, I will ask permission. I need to go, I need something, please, can I go? So it's by assuring the employer that she's aware of her place in Singapore society and would not test its limits, her employer is prepared to give her time off from the strictures of enclosure in order to enjoy the relative freedoms of the enclave. And for NGOs and the state, they also play a part in sponsoring activity spaces that are seen to be productive spaces where, as in the words of this May agency, we encourage domestic workers to spend their time there so that they can make use of their rest days wisely, safely, and productively. Right? So, and Masera, who's obviously internalized this discourse, says, I have every Sunday off, but if I just follow my friends and enjoy the time, jalan here, jalan there, meaning, wandering around, going out, there's no point. More important, she says, you have day off, is to join MOM. MOM is not mom, but Ministry of Manpower, so the government, or ACMI, an NGO, and do courses, study. Imagine studying on your rest day. So this is really the very best. Yes, to do something meaningful, learn computer, speak English, learn cooking for the employer, learn how to take care of old aged, because it is your job. So if you learn English, you can communicate with everyone in Singapore. That is very good. And importantly, she ends her explanation with, this will also make the employers happy. So at the back of the mind, maintaining their jobs, being aware of the huge debts and the need to send remittances becomes immense pressure that shapes their subjectivity. I will now briefly end by talking about the pandemic and what happened during pandemic times, because the same dormitory that you saw, Tuas View Dormitory, the mega dormitory with the cricket field and everything else, 6 years later became a new COVID-19 cluster and was locked down for many months with the migrant workers being sequestered within the dormitory. So I will just be brief here. As we know, COVID basically triggered nation states to retreat into the cocoon of my nation first policies, where citizenship became very important. So migrants basically became even more a sense of outsiders. Right. So, and this was in some ways disastrous for the temporary migration regime, because this sort of regime is predicated on continuous mobility across borders. It depends on churning workers back and forth across national borders in order to be able to make it work and to yield profits. So COVID, with the triggering of a new immobility regime, basically meant the end of this kind of cross-border mobility. So in many countries, migrant workers were stuck behind borders, on one side of the border or the other, and many were, in a sense, put into camps, or in Singapore's case, I'll just skip this one. In Singapore's case, they were, in a sense, confined to the dormitories that we've seen before. So, and what happens here is that the dormitory facilities were subjected to even higher degree of surveillance, mobility curbs, and containment policies in order to keep the migrant population as in the words of a minister, a separate infection away from the general population. So migrant workers became even more separated out as an outsider group. So here, the irony here is that while it's the largely unmanaged weekend migrant enclaves that were frowned upon as vectors of disease, it was the resulting confinement of these workers to their enclosed dormitories, right? I mean, 30 a room, 40 a room, that in a sense ironically contributed to the very rapid spread of the disease. So at one point in Singapore, at the height of the pandemic, migrant workers accounted for 90% of the cases, of the COVID cases in Singapore. So as far as the domestic workers are concerned, there was a further blurring of homework, private-public space distinctions with stricter confinement within the home for these domestic workers. And the NGOs did a small survey. So this is small and not very representative. I think it's only about 20, 30 people, but it gives you a sense of how the pandemic affected live-in migrant domestic workers in terms of increased workload, reduction in time off, increased containment within the home space, difficulties in remitting money, and further separation of production and social reproduction, and making it very difficult for them to sustain their transnational families. And for the nation state, what it raises is that it not only threw the fullness of migrant precarity into sharp relief, but it also indicated the unsustainability of the temporary migration regime for nation states, one's mobility stalls. So many of the industries found themselves in short supply of labor, and the category of essential labor had to be created in order to bring in people to run healthcare and key infrastructural services. So there was appeals to the government to bring in foreign workers in a controlled manner. So I can discuss this a bit more if you wish, but the long and short is that, as Anderson and colleagues say, what COVID-19 invites us to consider is migrants' role in ensuring the longer-term resilience of essential services. So finally, just to summarize and conclude, what I've tried to do here is to shift attention to the cities of migration in Asia that operate under a regime of temporary migration. And here, I've tried to show how the twin concepts of enclavization and enclosure as spatial temporal strategies of disciplinary power can be deployed, and what kinds of consequences they have for migrant life and labor. Enclavization denotes the intolerable difference and threats to urban security, whilst enclosure facilitates effective surveillance, restricts migrant mobility, and ensures the separation of migrant and citizen spaces. And in the context of this kind of temporary migration regime, where there are, as I mentioned, very few safeguards against loss of jobs and the threat of repatriation, migrant workers themselves are very keenly aware of their own temporariness and are very vigilant in trying to navigate the challenges of enclosure and enclavization. So, and as I tried to show in a short space of time, how these challenges intensified during pandemic times. So in that sense, I hope to be able to discuss further whether ideas of enclosure and enclavization can travel, but in the case of Singapore and in many parts of Asia, they are the processes that underpin the non-integration, not integration, but the non-integration of low-wage transient migrants in the city. Thank you very much. Yeah.